It was the year 2001, in a quiet little town tucked away in the western province of Buenos Aires, Argentina. On the surface, life in this town was simple. Neighbors knew each other, doors were often left unlocked, and the evenings were filled with the sound of children playing in the dusty streets. But behind this peaceful facade, one young woman's life was about to take a dark turn that would leave scars for years to come. Her name was Rachel Gomez, a stunning 22-year-old with warm eyes and a smile that could disarm even the coldest heart. She was the daughter of Richard Gomez, a hard-working mechanic who owned a small garage in town, and Elena Gomez, a devoted mother who ran the household. Rachel had two protective brothers, Oscar and Gustavo, and a younger sister, Monica, who adored her. Rachel often spent her afternoons helping her father at the family garage. It wasn't glamorous work. Her hands would get stained with grease and the smell of oil clung to her clothes, but she loved the time she spent with her father, and it gave her a sense of independence. One afternoon, while Rachel was at the garage, a rare visitor rolled in. A 1931 Ford collector car, old but elegant, clearly belonging to someone with wealth. The car needed repair, and its owner, Joseph Archer, a 52-year-old businessman, stepped out. The moment Joseph laid eyes on Rachel, something shifted in him. Despite being 30 years older than her, he was instantly captivated. Joseph Archer was not an ordinary man in town. He owned a successful poultry business, selling chickens and eggs, and possessed several plots of valuable land. People often saw him as wealthy and respectable. To Rachel, however, he was just another client, at least at first. But Joseph didn't hide his feelings. He complimented Rachel openly, sometimes with words that made her blush, sometimes with lingering stares that made her uncomfortable. Rachel, raised to be polite, would only smile and respond kindly, never wanting to offend him. As the days passed and the repairs on his car dragged on, Joseph used every visit as an excuse to see Rachel. Each time he brought her small gifts, flowers, chocolates, little trinkets that he claimed reminded him of her. For the Gomez family it was unusual, but Joseph seemed friendly enough. What no one could see at the time was how dangerous this attention would become. Months later, Joseph appeared at the Gomez household with a bold request. He wanted Rachel's hand in marriage. The entire family was stunned. Elena, her mother, immediately protested, questioning whether Joseph thought he was too old for her young daughter. Joseph only smiled, replying with the words that would echo ominously through time. "There is no age for love." Rachel herself wasn't thrilled by the proposal. She didn't feel the sparks of passion or the excitement of true love. But perhaps out of pressure, perhaps because she thought things might improve, she eventually agreed. On November 17, 2001, Rachel Gomez became Rachel Archer. The wedding was grand by small-town standards. Rachel wore a beautiful dress brought all the way from the United States by Joseph's mother, Elsa Archer, a stern woman who had always held a controlling grip over her son's life. Elsa had even gifted the couple a house in another town, ensuring they would begin their marriage under her shadow. At first glance, it seemed like Rachel's life was set. She had married into wealth, moved into a new home, and even soon became pregnant with their first child, a baby boy they named Jeremiah. To outsiders, it looked like a dream come true. But behind closed doors, things weren't as perfect. Joseph Archer's past was darker than most knew. He had spent years in the United States, where he dabbled in drugs and even served 3 years in prison for possession. Though he returned to Argentina to start fresh, his temperament remained unpredictable. By 2004, only 3 years into the marriage, Rachel's happiness began to crumble. She confided in her mother that she wanted a divorce. No reasons were given at the time, but her weary eyes told the story of suffering she kept hidden. Before any steps could be taken, Rachel became pregnant again, giving birth to their second son, Nathan. The arrival of another child didn't bring the family closer. Instead, it marked the beginning of deeper fractures. Friends and relatives noticed the growing distance. Visits became less frequent. Rachel seemed anxious, burdened, and trapped in a life she had never truly chosen. By 2005, the situation had deteriorated beyond control. Rachel had gone to the local police station 6 times, filing reports of both psychological and physical abuse at the hands of Joseph. Each time she was trembling but determined. She wanted to protect herself and her children. Finally, in July 2007, the court granted a restraining order, forbidding Joseph Archer from coming within 30 meters of his wife for 3 months. For Rachel, it was a small relief, but deep down she knew it wasn't enough. Joseph's obsession with her had turned toxic. And Joseph, furious about the divorce proceedings, began spreading accusations. He claimed Rachel was unfaithful, that she had taken lovers. rumors meant to tarnish her reputation and weaken her case. What Joseph didn't know was that Rachel had indeed met someone new, Daniel Grant, a gardener who had once worked for Joseph. Their connection was brief and never developed, but later Rachel met Oscar Lewis, a kind-hearted man she encountered at a pizza place. Oscar quickly became close to Rachel and her children. Unlike Joseph, he treated them with care and respect, and Rachel's family welcomed him warmly. The custody battle only fueled Joseph's rage. While the court allowed him to have his children from Friday to Monday, he frequently delayed returning them, driving Rachel into panic and sleepless nights. On one such occasion, when Rachel went to collect them, she was ambushed by 3 hooded men outside his house. She narrowly escaped by jumping over a gate, shaken but alive. When she told Joseph, he shrugged it off, dismissing her fears. But Rachel knew. She felt it deep inside. Her life was in danger. By January 2008, she was living in constant terror. Panic attacks haunted her, and every phone call from Joseph sent a shiver down her spine. What she didn't know was that the nightmare was about to reach its deadly peak. By early 2008, Rachel Gomez was living a life of constant fear. The young woman who once laughed easily, who once dreamed of a better life, was now trapped in a cage of anxiety and dread. Her once bright eyes often carried dark circles from sleepless nights, and her friends noticed that her smile was becoming rarer with each passing day. Her marriage to Joseph Archer had soured into something more sinister than just unhappiness. The controlling man she had married 7 years earlier had transformed into someone who seemed capable of anything. His love had become an obsession, and that obsession had turned to anger when Rachel finally decided to walk away. The restraining order gave her only a temporary sense of relief. But she knew that Joseph was not the kind of man who would let go easily. His pride was wounded, his reputation at risk, and his wealth in jeopardy. In his mind, Rachel was not just a wife leaving her husband, she was a possession slipping out of his control. The divorce proceedings were messy from the start. Not only was there the issue of dividing their assets, but also the bitter question of custody over their 2 children, Jeremiah and Nathan. Rachel wanted full custody, determined to raise her boys in a safe and nurturing environment. Joseph, however, insisted that he had equal rights. He pushed for weekend visits, and when the court granted him that privilege, he immediately began testing the boundaries. At first, Rachel tried to comply with the arrangement, though it pained her to see her children taken away. But Joseph rarely returned them on time. Friday to Monday soon stretched into Tuesday or Wednesday, and each time Rachel felt the rising panic that her sons might never be returned. One particular incident still haunted her. She had gone to Joseph's house after he delayed their return again. As she parked outside, 3 hooded men suddenly appeared, surrounding her car. Her heart pounded in her chest as she fumbled for the door handle. Instinct took over and she leapt from the car, running toward the gate. She scrambled over it, skinning her knees as she landed on the other side. Breathless and terrified, she called out for Joseph, who was nearby. But instead of concern, he brushed it off, treating the attack as though it were nothing more than an inconvenience. Rachel filed another complaint at the police station, but she knew words on paper were not enough to shield her. Each time she signed her name, she wondered if it would be the last action she ever took. Her fears weren't unfounded. By now, Rachel was experiencing frequent panic attacks. Her hands would tremble uncontrollably, her chest would tighten until it felt like she couldn't breathe, and cold sweat would run down her face even on warm nights. Monica, her younger sister, often tried to comfort her, but even she was shaken by the dark cloud looming over Rachel's life. Joseph's bitterness only grew. He told anyone who would listen that Rachel had betrayed him. He claimed she had lovers, painting her as an unfaithful wife to tarnish her image. Among those Joseph accused was Daniel Grant, the gardener who had once worked for him. Daniel denied it outright, insisting he had no romantic involvement with Rachel. But Joseph continued spreading the rumor, determined to turn suspicion away from himself. Then there was Oscar Lewis, the man Rachel had truly grown close to. Oscar was in his early 30s, calm and kind, the complete opposite of Joseph. He had met Rachel by chance at a pizza place while she was out with friends. Their connection had been immediate, and soon he was welcomed not only into Rachel's heart but also into her family's. Unlike Joseph, Oscar treated Rachel with respect, and more importantly, he treated her children with affection. For a while, Oscar became her light in the darkness, the hope that maybe she could rebuild her life. But Joseph's shadow loomed over everything. The custody arrangement continued to unravel. On one January weekend in 2008, Joseph failed once again to return the children on time. Rachel's frustration was at a breaking point. The court had set up a designated location in the El Romanza neighborhood where the children were to be exchanged during visitation, but Joseph ignored the agreement whenever it suited him. On January 16, 2008, Rachel and Monica went to the meeting point, waiting for Joseph to bring the children. He never showed. Hours later, at around 8:15 p.m., Rachel's phone rang. It was Joseph. His voice was unusually calm. He told her that their eldest son, Jeremiah, had a fever and that he was taking him to the emergency room. Rachel immediately asked him to bring the boy to her. She wanted to take care of her sick child herself. But Joseph refused, telling her not to worry and abruptly ending the call. Rachel's anxiety soared. Something felt wrong. Later that night, just minutes before 11 p.m., Rachel's phone rang again. The signal inside the house was weak, so she stepped outside onto the porch to take the call. She barely had time to say, "Hello," before a man emerged from behind the bushes. In an instant, the stillness of the night shattered. The gunman raised his weapon and fired. The first shot tore through the air, striking Rachel. She screamed and staggered, and Monica, frozen in shock, watched as her sister collapsed. 3 more shots rang out, echoing in the quiet neighborhood, each one tearing into Rachel's body. Monica's scream pierced the silence. She scrambled for her phone, trying desperately to call emergency services, but the call wouldn't connect. In a panic, she dialed Joseph's number, her voice frantic as she told him that Rachel had been shot. Joseph's response was chilling. He simply told her to call the neighbors. But Monica didn't know anyone nearby. She was helpless. Moments later, neighbors who had heard the gunfire rushed to the scene and called the authorities. By the time police arrived, it was too late. Rachel lay lifeless on the porch, her body riddled with bullets. At just 29 years old, her story had ended in blood. For Monica, the image would be forever etched in her memory, the sight of her sister lying on the ground, the echo of gunfire still in the air, and the knowledge that her life had been stolen in a moment of cold-blooded violence. The police immediately ruled out robbery. Nothing had been taken. This was not the work of a random criminal, it was a targeted execution. And the prime suspect was obvious: Joseph Archer. The summer air of July still hung heavy over the quiet city, but beneath its calm surface, the darkness of betrayal had already been set in motion. Sophie Carter, the bright young woman who had once filled every room with her warmth, was gone. Her friends, those who had once laughed with her, shared secrets with her, and sat across from her during late-night talks, were now suspects in the most unthinkable act. Detectives gathered every small piece of information they could find. The crime scene spoke louder than words. Sophie had not been taken by chance or by the hands of a stranger. This was personal. The brutality of the attack, the absence of forced entry, and the chilling silence of the aftermath revealed something more sinister. Whoever had taken her life had been close, too close. Among the first whispers that reached the police was the story of her closest friends, 3 young women who had spent almost every day with Sophie. Emily, Claire, and Hannah had shared everything with her, at least that's what the outside world believed. On the surface, they were inseparable, like sisters bound not by blood but by trust. Yet, behind the smiles and staged photos, a darker truth lingered. Emily, the outspoken one of the group, carried herself with confidence, but her eyes told a different story. Jealousy had long burned in her heart, hidden under layers of laughter. Claire, the quiet observer, often stood in Sophie's shadow, silently resenting the admiration Sophie drew effortlessly from everyone. Hannah, the most unpredictable of them, had secrets no one dared to question. It was this trio who would soon reveal themselves as the architects of Sophie's downfall. But at that time, investigators didn't yet have the full picture. All they had was a trail of inconsistencies. The girls' statements clashed with one another, minor details that didn't quite fit, a timeline that shifted ever so slightly. A nervous glance during questioning. The detectives leaned in. They had cracked cases before, but something about this one felt different. It was as if the truth was buried under a mask carefully crafted by those who had once been closest to the victim. And then came the discovery that would send a chill through the room. Sophie's phone records revealed a string of messages exchanged with her so-called friends on the very night she was killed. Messages filled with casual words, but laced with undertones of manipulation. The last few texts she had received were from Emily, asking her to come out that evening. Sophie had trusted her like she always did. That trust led her straight into the hands of those who wished her harm. The betrayal was no longer a theory, it was written in the digital footprints left behind. Once suspicion turned toward the friends, the narrative of the case took on a new form. No longer was it about an unknown predator lurking in the dark. It was about envy, resentment, and betrayal festering within the circle of trust. Detectives dug deeper into the girls' lives, pulling apart their connections to Sophie. They discovered that Sophie's natural charm often placed her at the center of attention, whether in school, in social gatherings, or even in relationships. Emily, Claire, and Hannah, though close to her, each carried silent grudges. To outsiders they were friends. But deep inside, the bond had soured into something far more dangerous. A chilling detail emerged during the investigation. Sophie had once confided in another classmate about strange behavior from her friends. She had noticed how Emily sometimes mocked her behind her back, how Claire's silence felt judgmental rather than supportive, and how Hannah's mood shifted unpredictably. But Sophie, ever trusting, brushed it off as normal teenage drama. Little did she know those cracks were widening into a deadly fracture. The evidence became more damning when investigators uncovered a series of group messages exchanged between the three girls. While the conversations initially appeared harmless, a closer look revealed coded hints, plans that could only be interpreted as plotting. Mentions of tonight, settling things, and making sure she doesn't get in the way anymore. Each phrase carried a chilling weight when viewed through the lens of what had happened. The detectives realized the murder was not impulsive. It had been orchestrated. The friends had lured Sophie out under the guise of a normal night together, but instead, they had dragged her into the shadows of betrayal. When confronted with these discoveries, Emily cracked first. Her confidence faltered, and beneath the pressure of relentless questioning, her carefully built facade began to crumble. Tears streamed down her face as she muttered fragments of the truth. Though she tried to shield herself from full responsibility, her words pointed directly at Claire and Hannah. The betrayal wasn't just of Sophie, it was of each other too. The unity they once held now shattered into accusations and desperate attempts to save themselves. For detectives, the puzzle was finally coming together. Sophie hadn't been taken by an enemy from the outside. She had been betrayed by the people she called her best friends. And the final piece of the puzzle was still waiting to be revealed: the horrifying details of how they carried out their plan. The sun had barely risen over the town when detectives called Sophie's friends back into the precinct. Their earlier statements had raised more questions than answers. Emily's breakdown the day before had cracked the group's seemingly perfect bond, and now the investigators sensed that behind the facade of devastated friends lay something far darker. The girls sat nervously in the sterile interrogation room. The tension between them was almost visible, like an invisible thread stretched to its breaking point. Emily's eyes darted around, refusing to meet Claire's glare. Hannah remained still, arms folded, as though bracing herself for the storm she knew was coming. Detectives decided to separate them this time. They wanted to chip away at the pact of silence that bound these young women together. In isolation, their stories began to diverge. Claire insisted that she and Sophie had patched things up after their fight. Emily, however, admitted that Sophie's presence often made her feel overshadowed. And Hannah, usually the quiet one, slipped, mentioning something about a plan that got out of control. That word, plan, set alarm bells ringing. Investigators went back to the mountain of digital evidence. On Hannah's phone, buried beneath dozens of deleted files, they recovered fragments of encrypted group chats. Slowly, painstakingly, they pieced the messages back together. What they read was chilling. The chats revealed weeks of growing resentment towards Sophie. Claire had accused her of betrayal, Emily had felt replaced, and Hannah, though quieter, had gone along with their schemes. The conversations hinted at a gathering the night Sophie vanished. The tone was dark, laced with anger, jealousy, and a need to teach her a lesson. Detectives now had enough to confront them again. They laid the recovered chats on the table one by one. The girls' faces drained of color. Hannah bit her lip, trying not to cry. Claire exploded, insisting the messages were taken out of context. Emily, trembling, whispered, "It wasn't supposed to happen like that." The room fell into a suffocating silence. The officers pressed harder, asking what exactly wasn't supposed to happen. But none of them dared to say it aloud. For the first time, it was no longer a mystery of where Sophie had gone, it was becoming a matter of what her closest friends had done to her. That night, detectives drove to the edge of town, following vague directions Emily had mumbled under pressure. It led them to an abandoned field bordered by thick woods. The ground was uneven, and the silence of the night felt unnatural. A chill wind rustled the trees as the officers scanned the area with flashlights. Suddenly, one of the beams caught something disturbing: freshly disturbed soil. A shallow patch, not wide but large enough to hide something. The air grew colder, heavier, as if nature itself resisted the revelation about to surface. The officers began digging. Each strike of the shovel seemed to echo louder than the last. And then, the unmistakable sight of fabric. A piece of clothing. A pale sleeve torn muddied. Within moments, their worst fears were confirmed. Buried just beneath the surface lay Sophie's lifeless body. The girl once full of dreams and laughter was now reduced to silence, hidden away by those she trusted most. The discovery broke the community. Word spread quickly. The missing girl was not kidnapped by a stranger, not lost to an accident, but betrayed by the very people she called her friends. The detectives stood there in grim silence. For them, the investigation had shifted from suspicion to undeniable truth. Now, it was no longer about finding Sophie. It was about proving exactly how and why her friends had killed her. The courtroom was packed. Journalists filled the benches, their cameras flashing each time the heavy wooden doors creaked open. Families of both the victim and the accused sat silently, their faces pale, their eyes sunken from weeks of grief and disbelief. This was no ordinary trial. It wasn't a case of a faceless predator targeting an innocent girl. It was a story of friends turned killers, a betrayal so vicious it made national headlines. Claire, Emily, and Hannah walked into the courtroom in handcuffs, their once carefully crafted images of innocence shattered. They no longer looked like carefree teenagers. Dressed in plain prison-issued clothing, they seemed smaller, weaker, almost consumed by the weight of what they had done. But despite their appearance, each carried a different demeanor. Claire with her chin lifted defiantly, Emily trembling with guilt, and Hannah staring blankly as though her mind had detached itself from the nightmare. The prosecutor wasted no time. With piercing words, he painted the three girls not as victims of circumstance but as predators fueled by jealousy and hatred. He recounted their encrypted chats, their veiled threats, and finally their actions on that fateful night. His voice thundered as he declared, Sophie trusted them. She thought they were her friends. And they lured her to her death. Gasps filled the courtroom. Sophie's parents clutched each other, their grief so raw it silenced the crowd. The defense attorneys tried to counter with a different story. They claimed that Sophie's death was not premeditated murder but a tragic accident. According to them, the girls had only intended to scare Sophie, to humiliate her, but things escalated beyond control. It was youthful recklessness, one lawyer argued, not cold-blooded intent. But the jury had the evidence in front of them. The disturbing chat logs, the shallow grave, and the inconsistencies in the girls' statements. Piece by piece the truth was laid bare. When Emily was called to the stand, the courtroom fell into a suffocating silence. She trembled as she adjusted the microphone. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, I didn't want it to go that far. We just wanted her to feel what we felt, to feel left out. But then Claire, her voice broke and she buried her face in her hands. Claire's eyes flared with rage. She leaned toward her lawyer, hissing words that only he could hear. To everyone else, the gesture revealed cracks in their once united front. The pact of silence was crumbling. As the trial went on, the prosecution revealed a shocking detail that shifted the entire case. Forensic experts testified that Sophie hadn't died instantly. She had been injured, beaten, but she was still alive when she was buried in the shallow grave. The revelation sent ripples of horror through the courtroom. Emily collapsed into sobs. Hannah looked down, her lips quivering. But Claire clenched her fists, her jaw tight, as though holding back an eruption of rage. The prosecutor turned to the jury. This was not an accident. This was cruelty. This was betrayal of the deepest kind. Sophie's last moments were filled with pain, fear, and the realization that her own friends had condemned her to die. The words cut through the room like a knife. When the jury finally left to deliberate, the atmosphere was unbearable. Hours felt like days. Sophie's parents sat silently, clutching a photo of their daughter, her smile forever frozen in time. At last the jury filed back in. The foreman stood, his voice steady but cold. We find the defendants guilty of murder in the first degree. The courtroom erupted. Sophie's parents wept. Reporters rushed outside to relay the verdict. And for the first time since Sophie's disappearance, there was a sense of closure, however painful. The judge delivered the sentences. Claire, identified as the ringleader, received the harshest punishment: life imprisonment without parole. Emily and Hannah, though found equally guilty, were granted the possibility of parole decades later due to their expressions of remorse. Claire screamed as the gavel struck, her fury echoing across the room. Emily was led away sobbing, her hands trembling as the cuffs clicked around her wrists. Hannah walked quietly, her face pale, as though she had already accepted her fate long before the verdict. When the courtroom doors finally closed, the echoes of the trial still lingered in the town. For many, Sophie's murder had been more than just another crime, it had shattered the very foundation of trust. Parents whispered to their children about the dangers of false friends, and teenagers stared at one another with suspicion, realizing that betrayal could come from the very people they laughed with every day. Sophie's parents became living symbols of grief. They attended every hearing, every appeal, their lives now revolving around the memory of their daughter. They often visited Sophie's grave, leaving flowers and small notes, begging the universe for answers that would never come. Her mother once said in an interview, "The hardest part is knowing she died thinking her friends hated her. She must have been so scared." Those words haunted everyone who heard them. Claire, locked away in a high-security prison, never admitted guilt. She became infamous behind bars, her cold demeanor earning her the nickname, the Queen of Ice. Guards described her as manipulative, always scheming, never remorseful. Some said she thrived on the notoriety, enjoying the fact that her name was whispered across the country. Emily, on the other hand, carried her guilt like a crushing weight. In prison, she often broke down during interviews with psychologists, replaying that night over and over. She confessed that she heard Sophie's voice in her sleep, begging to be saved. She said she wished she could trade places with her. But remorse did not erase the truth. Sophie was gone and Emily's tears could never bring her back. Hannah faded into the background. She didn't seek attention, didn't cry publicly. She followed the rules, lived quietly behind prison walls and spoke very little. Some wondered if her silence was a shield, a way to hide from the horror of what she had taken part in. Others thought it was her way of punishing herself. The story remained in the headlines for years. Documentaries were made, podcasts dissected every detail, and online forums debated whether Emily and Hannah deserved a chance at parole or if they should rot in prison forever. But no matter the debate, the verdict never changed. Sophie was betrayed by those she trusted most, and nothing could ever undo that. The town eventually tried to move on, but the scars ran deep. Teachers warned students about jealousy and toxic friendships. Parents became stricter, watching over their children more carefully. And teenagers, once carefree, now whispered about betrayal in hushed voices. Sophie's legacy became both a warning and a memory. She was remembered not just as a victim, but as a bright, kind girl whose light had been extinguished too soon. Schools held assemblies in her honor, teaching students about trust, kindness, and the dangers of envy. Her name became a symbol of innocence lost to cruelty. Years later, Sophie's story was still told, in classrooms, in documentaries, and around dinner tables. Her smiling face in photographs was a reminder of the fragile nature of trust, and of how darkness can sometimes hide behind the brightest of smiles. For Claire, Emily, and Hannah, prison walls became their reality. Time passed, but their fates remained sealed. Claire embraced her notoriety, Emily drowned in regret, and Hannah sank into silence. They had written their own story in blood, and its ending was carved into stone. And so, the betrayal lived on, not just in the memories of those who knew Sophie, but in the collective conscience of a town forever changed.